Hello, and welcome to Hobbit Hot Takes, a queer reread of The Lord of the Rings. This long-expected episode. My name is Iris. I use they, them pronouns. Usual disclaimer that this is based on my personal interpretations and opinions. If a queer Lord of the Rings is not your cup of tea, I recommend you leave that cup of tea alone. And if it is, once again, welcome aboard. In this episode, I'm going to talk about Book 1, Chapter 1, A Long-Expected Party. Making this episode has taken longer than expected, mostly because I haven't gone the best way about it, I guess. How many excuses do you want? I've had some technical difficulties. Anyways, in this episode, we meet Bilbo, Frodo, Gandalf. We see a glimpse of Sam and Merry and a lot of other hobbits. For a quick chapter summary, this chapter is centered around Bilbo Baggins's 111th birthday, which is also Frodo's 33rd birthday, at the end of which Bilbo disappears from the Shire, leaving Frodo his magic ring. Before the party, we meet some hobbits talking and gossiping in a pub. Gandalf appears in the Shire before the party, both to provide fireworks and to see Bilbo off. The party itself is large and extravagant and takes all day. At the end of a special dinner, Bilbo gives a speech and disappears into thin air, leaving behind shocked hobbits. Bilbo leaves behind his ring, but not without some help from Gandalf. Frodo is shocked to receive the ring, and Gandalf warns him not to use it, unlike what Bilbo had done. And Frodo deals with the aftermath of the party and a lot of rude hobbits. I think that's it in a nutshell. This chapter discussion will include some stuff about the events of this chapter and some more general talking points. There are quite a few things to talk about being at the beginning of the novel, so bear with me as we go through it all. I think that will be the tendency in these first chapters. Before we start, I have a note on the ages of the hobbits. As you may know, they live longer than humans do, up to the 120s. And they seem to mature slower than humans. They come of age at 33, and the irresponsible 20s between childhood and coming of age at 33 are called their tweens. This use differs from the normal usage of tweens as preteens. And this suggests that until their 20s, they are considered children, and until 33, they are not adults. I found I found an article by user Dreamflower at lotrgfic.com with some calculations that I found very useful, as well as a table that compares hobbit ages to human ages. The basis of Dreamflower's calculations is equating the hobbit 33 years old to a human 21, and each hobbit year to 2/3 of a human year in terms of maturity. They do note that this is not the only possibility, that, for example, after reaching the respective adulthoods, the differences between hobbits and humans might even out. And I actually have some thoughts of my own, but I can't wrap my head around that much math, so the calculations made by Dreamflower will serve me quite well. And I do agree that it's not just a cultural difference, I think it's the level of maturity. I recommend reading this article or post because it goes through some thoughts on this actually. It can be a little bit confusing to be referring to two sets of numbers, because I do want to bring out the human equivalence of the ages of hobbits, especially when they are younger. But as I said, two sets of numbers might be a bit confusing, so I'll try to mostly use verbal descriptions of ages when it comes to the human equivalence. Like a 20 to 33-year-old hobbit is a tween or a teenager, and approximately 33 to 50-year-old hobbit would be a young adult. Here's a table I created on the hobbits' ages, just to, bring you up to speed. Because especially if you come to The Lord of the Rings, from the movies leave out the age differences between the four main hobbits. They actually have quite big gaps. So as you can see, Frodo is 12 years older than Sam, 14 years older than Merry, and 22 years older than Pippin. This is give or take a year because I've only looked at their birth years, not their exact birth dates. These years are taken from Appendix C, but at least the ages of Frodo and Pippin are mentioned in the text itself. Also worth noting, Merry is 8 years older than Pippin. Well, in addition to the information in this table, when Frodo was orphaned, he would have been about 12. So about 5 in human years, so quite young. At the beginning of the journey of these 4 hobbits, they are all more or less adult, although Pippin is not yet of age. But as you can see, at the time of Bilbo's party, these age differences are more pronounced, with Frodo obviously reaching adulthood, while Sam is a tween, and so is Merry, whereas Pippin is only a child. You don't necessarily need all this information to enjoy the books, but I wanted to give it here, both as a detail that may be of interest and also in anticipation of some speculation and analysis that I have planned. I think it will come in a few chapters. Let's talk about Bilbo. Bilbo is clearly a gay uncle. He's a lifelong bachelor, has no children of his own, but he is favored by certain of his younger relatives, especially from the Took and Brandybuck families. We find out that many of these younger relatives have a penchant for adventure, just like Bilbo, which in my reading is code for queerness. I will expand on that in a bit. The way that Bilbo is treated by his community and his peers, his relatives, his neighbors, is twofold, a little conflicted. He's treated with respect on the one hand, but caution on the other hand. His queerness or his peculiarity is tolerated rather than encouraged. And it's largely because he's rich and from a respectable family. His adventures and the riches he brought home from them aroused gossip and local legend. But at the same time, his peers prefer Bilbo himself not to talk about his journeys or his peculiar hobbies such as poetry. This is particularly evidenced by the reaction to his speech at his party. He's not ostracized, but he's not fully accepted either. And of course, his supernatural lack of aging makes him stand out even further. Privilege plays a large part in this, because it's Bilbo's wealth and status that allow him not only a comfortable lifestyle, but also the relative respect of his community. As far as we know, the only job he's ever had is the burglar job for the dwarfs. And even though he came back with riches, he didn't really need them. He was well off even before his adventure. He's living on his family money and quite possibly rent from the residents of Bagshot Row. Bilbo can afford to do what he wants and ignore the opinions of others, because there's not much that anyone can take away from him. And I also think that a community such as the upper or middle class Hobbiton can allow one person to take the role of the queer, eccentric neighbor. But I think if there are more candidates for that position, they would be met with more resistance and rejection. An additional note on the young relatives, I think this is as good a time as any to bring them up. At the end of The Hobbits, there's a short description of Bilbo's later years, which partly overlaps with the description at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. At the end of The Hobbits, Bilbo's nephews and nieces are mentioned, but in the beginning of the Fellowship, it has become younger cousins, and we only ever see evidence of these younger cousins being of the nephew persuasion. My personal theory is that this fits perfectly with my view of Merry and Pippin as transmasculine people. And clearly they have come out, and everyone respects their identity. Of course, the lack of nieces and girl hobbits, especially adventurers one, is still a glaring issue. Hardly a surprising one, though. in connection to these younger relatives that gather around Bilbo, I think Bilbo has an important role in his community of a preserver of history in two ways, really. First of all, he shares human elven legends and histories, often in his own translation, which is something that the hobbits might not be very familiar with otherwise. Secondly, I think Bilbo is the connection for these young hobbits to their own history, their own family history and hobbit history, specifically parts of it that their own families might be hushing up. I think the reason that these young relatives, consisting of the children of various families, including Tooks and Brandybucks, some of whom live quite a bit further away, I think the reason they are drawn to him is his storytelling, which is a break from the unimaginative everyday life and also a link to their history. I think that in Hobbit society in general and in the Took and Brandybuck families, there used to be more progressive thinking and tolerance of features such as adventurousness or poetics, and that they've become more conservative over time. And stories of the transgressive ancestors have gone out of favor. So their own families are not telling the stories of these adventurers anymore because they are seen as queer. So Bilbo might be the only reason that these stories are preserved, because Hobbit history is mostly oral at this point. Children and young hobbits might know of a great uncle or great aunt that disappeared on an adventure, but if they want details, they go to Bag End. So Bilbo is their connection to three things, really. A more poetic world, the stories of the wide world around them, somewhere far away, and their own queer histories. And sharing these connections would also enable these young hobbits to build deeper connections with each other. And that's why I think Bilbo is a one hobbit oral history project and a hub that connects these younger queer hobbits. Honestly, I'm imagining a sort of unofficial society that gathers at Bilbo's place for presumably food, drink, and stories. I don't think this is implausible, seeing how Tolkien himself had at least a few of these clubs of storytellers. And no doubt Bilbo also had young friends who took after their conservative parents more, who were curious about the stories but maybe wouldn't want to hear too much at once, or who might want to hear about elves but not be so comfortable with the idea that hobbits were peculiar in this way. Or maybe those that admired him but still felt the judgment in their environment of associating with the peculiar Mr. Baggins. And of course, this is probably how Frodo, Merry, and Pippin became friends. I don't think Sam was present in the same way because of the class divide, although we do know that clearly he had a relationship with Bilbo and had heard some of his stories, and Bilbo taught him to read and write, apparently. But yeah, I think Sam's relationship with Frodo, Merry, and Pippin really only deepens when they leave the Shire. So I don't think he was part of these potential gatherings.
What connects Bilbo, Frodo, Merry, Pippin, and Sam is the desire or susceptibility to leave the Shire. I think this follows from their queerness. First of all, it's stated and shown repeatedly to be an un-hobbit-like quality. Hobbits live their lives, especially Shire hobbits, live their lives in a rather small area, and they're suspicious of outsiders, to the point that Hobbiton folk think people from Buckland are queer, and vice versa. Bucklanders do appear to be actually slightly different from the rest of the Shire, for example in being more outgoing and not afraid of boats. But the fact that this assessment of queer goes both ways is illuminating of the Shire mentality as a whole. Hobbits who believe in elves and dragon magic, like Sam, are thought to be odd, as we see in the Green Dragon in the next chapter. Hobbits who have left the Shire for an adventure, like Bilbo, are definitely odd or queer. And hobbits who would leave the Shire, such as Merry and Pippin, whether they have a conscious desire to do so, or whether they just would take the opportunity if it came, these hobbits would sense that there's something separating them from their peers. And secondly, obviously, living in an environment that views you as a little bit different or a weirdo, or where you just don't find connection, that would in itself make you susceptible to leaving, to wanting to see what else is out there. Gandalf picked Bilbo to go on his adventure because he sensed something in him that maybe he needs one, a queer awakening. You could say that Gandalf sensed Bilbo's Tookish side. Similarly, our 5 main hobbits sense something in each other that draws them together. There's a sense of recognition, whether conscious or unconscious. Bilbo doesn't adopt Frodo just because he's an orphan. He adopts him because he recognizes something of himself in him. And equally, Frodo and Sam don't become friends just because Sam is Frodo's servant. And Merry and Pippin don't become Frodo's friends just because they're related. They all recognize the queerness in each other and band together. The Gandalf of Lord of the Rings is different from the Gandalf of the Hobbit. Not a different character, not out of character, but different sides of him are revealed in a more serious and in-depth work. However, he enters the stage as the figure familiar from the Hobbits, an old man with a pointed hat, a silver scarf, and bushy eyebrows, evoking hopes of fireworks and magic. His real business was far more difficult and dangerous, but the Shire folk knew nothing about it. And as the story progresses, even in the first chapter, we start to see more sides to Gandalf. But to the general Shire folk, Gandalf is just a reminder of the legendary past, even if legendary on the small scale, in that it's just remembered by the oldest hobbits. And coincidentally, or not, Gandalf and his fireworks reappear to the hobbits just before they pass out of living memory. I wonder if this has been the pattern of his public appearances in the Shire for some generations now. Obviously, he visits more often than that, perhaps whisking some young queer hobbits on an adventure every now and then, but not necessarily leaving a big impression on the population at large every time. And a bit like the twofold attitude towards Bilbo, every hobbit's view of Gandalf is conflicted. He is, after all, a wizard, and magic is scary. And yet, his fireworks are everyone's favorites. Basically, when he provides entertainment, he's looked for and fondly remembered. But when he's giving young hobbits ideas that the every hobbit isn't capable of understanding, or of letting himself understand, he is distrusted, if not outright feared. Gandalf brings the outside world to the Shire, but he doesn't push it on the hobbits. Those who can't take more than a magic trick with light and explosions can stay comfortably ignorant and insulated. But those who are open to more may get swept away by the road. As previously mentioned, I think the hobbits that Gandalf sends on an unsolicited adventure are closeted queer hobbits, and that journey is their chance at an awakening. Obviously, this means that Gandalf has impeccable hobbit gaydar. On a real-world note, I don't mean to suggest that to find the adventure, or the elves, or the hidden world, or queerness. I lost the beginning of this sentence, and I'm looking right at it. I don't mean to suggest that to find the adventure, and whatever that stands for, you need someone to come find you and bring it to you and send you on the road. It's not something that you need to be taught. It might help to have the cumulative knowledge of a community around you, or even just one person that tells you, hey, this is the thing. But it's not the only way to find the adventure. The hobbits who leave the Shire have always had it inside them. Gandalf just helps bring it out. And I'm certain that, one, there are hobbits Gandalf has taken on an adventure that Bilbo and therefore the reader doesn't know about. And two, I'm absolutely sure that there are hobbits who have started adventuring more or less quietly, without any help from a queer sniffing wizard. Farmer Maggot comes to mind. We might talk about him a bit later, when he comes up in a few chapters.
I think it's interesting that in this chapter, the first perspectives we get on Bilbo and Frodo are through the eyes of other hobbits. And the first actual scene, apart from like general descriptions of the time, doesn't include Bilbo or Frodo, but some working class hobbits drinking in a pub. So we meet the gaffer, who is Sam's father. Also, I love that Sam's father is considered a potato expert. Apart from potatoes, the gaffer, Hamfast Gamgee, is basically an expert on all things Baggins, because he works as a gardener at Bag End, and is also his neighbour. The other patrons of the Ivy Bush are not quite as warm towards Bilbo as the gaffer is, but the gaffer defends him. The gaffer says that Bilbo and Frodo are decent hobbits and respectful and generous, showing that he bases his opinion on their behavior, their actions, rather than their reputation or status. But being a hobbit, the gaffer also delights in sharing his information and gossiping, for example, about the death of Frodo's parents, who were drowned. I love this word. Also, what was the Baggins doing on a boat? No wonder that this event arouses rumours. Hobbits don't like boats. We also get the first mentions of Sam, who, like I said, is the gaffer's son, his youngest son, who has at this point taken over the gardening duties, or most of them, at Bag End. Sam is 21 at this point in Hobbit years, so an early tween. The way the gaffer talks about Sam in relation to the Bagginses sheds some light on the class divide. The gaffer talks about Sam mixing with his betters and also expresses this suspicion towards Sam learning his letters. What we can gather from this is that apparently not every hobbit learns to read, and it's a more upper class thing at this point in Hobbit society. Honestly, I think the gaffer is being a bit dismissive about Sam. This is also the scene where we get the first occurrences of the word queer. And surprisingly, just in this scene, which in my copy covers about 3 pages, there are 8 occurrences of the word queer. Hobbits use this word to refer to anything strange, whether that be unfamiliar or weird to them. And it has a negative connotation. But as a 21st century queer person, I derive a lot of amusement from a lot of these occurrences. The patrons at the Ivy Bush hold the view that Frodo, who grew up with his Brandybuck relatives after his parents died, was basically saved by Bilbo, saved from the influence of what they call that queer breed. Considering that they also think Bilbo is queer, we can glean that they think Bucklanders were weird indeed. Although, of course, Bilbo is more familiar to them. But even in this, the gaffer comes to the defense of the Bagginses. I'm going to read a quote. "You can say what you like, gaffer, but Bag End's a queer place and its folk are queerer. And you can say what you like about what you know no more of than you do of boating, Mr. Sandyman," retorted the gaffer, disliking the miller even more than usual. "If that's being queer, then we could do with a bit more queerness in these parts." In conjunction with the gardener post, Sam has also taken on the mantle as the inside informant of Bag End to other hobbits. When they're talking about Bilbo's supposed mounds of treasure, the gaffer says, "My lad Sam will know more about that." Just a little bit later, we find out that a rumour started going around that there were going to be fireworks, probably started by the knowledgeable Sam. I think it's worth noting that the first action we get from Sam is, well, this rumor, this result of his knowledge ability. He's having his eyes and ears open while he works at the at Bag End, because obviously it's a precursor to his activities as a conspirator. If you know, you know. If you don't, you'll find out soon enough. On to the party. So, Bilbo's party, which is also Frodo's party, but again, everyone seems to forget about that, is an extravagant all-day event with 3 meals served and food available between them, of course, and entertainment and gifts for all. I had made a TikTok before about how even if Sam had been older, he probably wouldn't have been a guest at the party because he's a working class hobbit and probably would have been working the party. But on this reread, I have to go back on that. I don't think that's correct, because we hear from the gaffer that everyone is invited, everyone in the Hobbiton and Bywater area, in addition to many guests from further away. If the gaffer is saying that everyone is invited, that definitely must also mean the poorer and working class hobbits in the immediate area. So presumably anyone who was working at the party was brought in from further away. And there's some evidence of this when it's mentioned that cooks were brought in from all over the place. But I still notice that there aren't many mentions of the people who are working, whether it's for the preparations or the party itself. The work, the labor that goes into putting on the party is often described in the passive voice. Tents went up, an open-air kitchen was erected, wine was served, and so on. Just a random note that comes from reading the novel way too many times. Bilbo clearly enjoys putting on this huge, magnificent party. And he also enjoys confusing and shocking his fellow hobbits, probably even more than the extravagance. Though he is markedly different from his community, and attitudes towards him range from hesitantly tolerant to mean rumors, he's affable enough that his birthday is very well attended. Of course, everyone also wants to get in on the food and drinks and gifts, but it seems that he's still liked. And he's old enough, queer enough, and rich enough that he can do what he wants. And how he wants to leave the Shire is with attention, fireworks, and a prank. There must be hundreds of hobbits, if not up to 1,000 maybe, at this party, because Bilbo has a separate tent for just his 144 closest friends and relatives, where they have a special dinner. After which, Bilbo gives his famous speech where he's really in his element. This scene has one of my favorite lines. You probably know which one I'm talking about. And I haven't written this down, so let's see if I can get it right. I don't know half of you half as well as I should like. And I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. I'll check that later. As Bilbo is giving his speech, the hobbits are benevolent at first, but they start to get uncomfortable as the speech progresses from the short and obvious that they prefer to complicated riddles, unconventional language, and trips down memory lane. They're very worried that he's going to recite poetry at them. But just as Bilbo's about to lose his audience, he makes an announcement. Well, he announces that he has an announcement. He basically says that he's leaving and then disappears into thin air in a flash of light. Of course, the hobbits are shocked and angry at him. But there's food and drink. There are some references to the Tooks and Rory Brandybuck, who is an old Brandybuck relative, being a bit more tuned in than others. While other hobbits think that Bilbo is just playing a trick and isn't serious about leaving, Rory Brandybuck has a feeling that there's something into this. Obviously, Bilbo's disappearance was due to the ring, and the flash of light was added by Gandalf, who wanted to prevent rumors about Bilbo disappearing into thin air being spread and possibly reaching the wrong ears outside the Shire. But Bilbo hurries back to Bergen to do some last-minute packing, and Gandalf shows up soon after. Bilbo intends to leave Frodo his ring, which he has in an envelope with his inheritance and some other papers, but he's struggling to leave it behind. And this is the first sign we get of the ring's hold on Bilbo, and the first sign we get that the ring has a will of its own, of sorts, and that it influences its wearer. I think this conversation between Gandalf and Bilbo is very well written. I just really enjoy this scene, even though it's a bit uncomfortable, because it's friends having a fight, and I don't like that. But there are a lot of lines I like in this conversation. I guess we're seeing Bilbo at his most serious. He says things like, I think I need a holiday. Probably a permanent holiday. I don't expect I shall return. He's talking about how he's grown weary. And it's not just, although he doesn't know it, it's not just to do with his age, of course. He feels like butter scraped over too much bread, which I think is a great metaphor. The ring is resisting all of Bilbo's attempts to leave it. Bilbo needs, as Gandalf says later, Bilbo needs all his help to be able to part with it. Gandalf tries to be friendly at first, and Bilbo gets defensive. He even puts his hand on the hilt of his sword, and Gandalf has to get angry. That seems to do the trick and shock Bilbo into realizing how irrationally he's behaving, and finally he's able to leave it behind. I think this show of Gandalf's power is interesting because he seemed to grow, but it's not completely clear to us whether he really grew or whether that was the impression that Bilbo got, whether there was some magic or power at work in how Bilbo perceived. I don't think Gandalf, actually grew in size, but I think there's something, you might not want to call it magic, but something of Gandalf's Maya nature in how Bilbo's perception of him changes. That Gandalf is showing a side of himself that is not normally seen in his human form. I don't know. I think something that's interesting here is, I think it's notable that Bilbo doesn't hand the ring directly to Frodo or even to Gandalf. He puts it on the mantelpiece. But as soon as he sets it down, he's released from its power and he feels a relief. And I think this must come from his intention in putting it down. He is mentally transferring its possession to Frodo. I guess either the ring or the part in Bilbo that's attached to the ring senses this intention and this change of possession. And this shows that it's not just physical possession of the ring that makes you a ring bearer, but your relationship with it. I guess this becomes interesting later when Sam has the ring. This is going to be much, much later at the end of book 4 and the beginning of book 6. So that's going to be a while. But yeah, it will be interesting to think about Sam's relationship to the ring and him giving it back to Frodo. So Frodo doesn't just inherit Bilbo's money and his ring and his house. He also, well, first of all, he inherits Bilbo's wizard. Secondly, he inherits Bilbo's party, which is still in process when Bilbo leaves, and Frodo is left to tie up loose ends and placate the guests who are mad at Bilbo for disappearing, and, well, not tidy up himself, but watch over the tidying up, as well as dealing with the public outrage and or curiosity that follows the party, people who come up to Bag End the next day, and the large amount of gifts that Bilbo has left behind, a lot of which are snarky, but some of which are very heartfelt and needed. Frodo also inherits the enormous public and social pressures of Bilbo, being the master of Bag End and being the person that everyone expects to be able to explain what the hell happened with Bilbo and represent him. And clearly in this chapter we see that hobbits just think that they are entitled to Frodo's time and his energy. Really, hobbits, a lot of people have pointed this out, but hobbits don't appear all that pleasant in this chapter. Bag End is run over with them, some of them trying to dig holes, seeking for Bilbo's treasure, and some of them just being generally unpleasant like the Sackville Baggins is. Merry appears. He has a fairly small part in this chapter, but he is seen helping Frodo deal with the aftermath and the Hobbit invasion at Bag End the day after the party, and he even gets a few lines. We get a bit of banter between Merry and Frodo. But curiously, according to the ages I presented earlier, Merry is supposed to be only a young tween. He would be, his age would be equivalent to about 13 in human years. And I would say that he appears older here. As Frodo's friend, he appears to be kind of on an equal footing, like an adult. So I wonder if the age gap is something that Tolkien only decided on later, or something that he overlooked here. It's not very significant, because the next time we see Merry, he will be an adult. And I'm not saying that Merry, being a very responsible teenager and taking care of practical stuff, is out of character for him either. I will talk more about Merry in the near future, I promise. Another thing I think is interesting is Lobelia telling Frodo, you should have gone too, and you don't belong here. And when Frodo relays this meeting to Gandalf, he says, I long to disappear, and he says that he almost put on his ring, but of course he didn't. But it really appears as if Lobelia wants Frodo to disappear, and that makes Frodo want to disappear too. And already we see the difference between Bilbo and Frodo, between their relationship to the ring, because Gandalf has already warned Frodo not to use the ring, where Bilbo would regularly use the ring to avoid his relatives, such as the Sackville Bagginses. Frodo can't do that. He can't take advantage of what seems to be the only useful quality of the ring. So he has inherited this family heirloom, but he doesn't really get the advantages that come with it, the benefits or the privileges even. A few small things for the end. In the scene where Bilbo is putting his things together to leave after he has disappeared from the party, wait, I need to get my book. From a locked drawer, smelling of mothballs, he took out an old cloak and hood. They had been locked up as if they were very precious, but they were so patched and weather-stained that their original colour could hardly be guessed. It might have been dark green. They were rather too large for him. In just a few sentences, that's a lot of hinting, I think. Clearly, the very obvious implications are that this is the hood and cloak that Bilbo got from Balin at the very beginning of his adventure in the Hobbits, and he has kept it all these years, and it's his travelling cloak, and clearly a possession that he values. He keeps it in a locked drawer I checked The Hobbit, and the cloak that Bilbo was given by Balin was dark green, and obviously being a dwarf cloak, it would be too big for him. I just think that's very cute that he kept it all these years and now he's digging it out to go on a final adventure. Another little detail, and this may be more of my personal interpretation. Let me find it. When Bilbo is having the smaller private dinner of 144 guests in his special tent, during his speech, people start cheering and playing the instruments that they have received as guests. Indeed, in one corner, some of the young tooks and brandybucks, supposing Uncle Bilbo to have finished, since he had plainly said all that was necessary, now got up an impromptu orchestra and began a merry dance tune. And some people got on the table and began dancing. My reading of this is that absolutely Merry and Pippin were among those young tooks and brandybucks that started that orchestra. Merry being, as I said, a young teenager, and Pippin being just a child around this time. So we may not see them at the party like we do in the movie, but we can choose to see them here. Another thing that occurred to me, that when Bilbo is leaving and intending to leave Frodo his ring, he puts it in an envelope with his will and testament and all the papers that prove Frodo's inheritance. And then, as you know, he has great trouble leaving this envelope behind. And that makes me think, what would have happened if he had slipped that envelope into his pockets and Gandalf had not made sure he left it behind? Because he wouldn't have just taken his ring with him. He would have taken all the documents that secure Frodo's future. I just think that's interesting. I don't know if I have anything more to say about it, but I think it's interesting. Frodo would have been left without his inheritance, or at least having to fight for it. And he definitely would have had to fight the Sackville Bagginses for it. And he really, I guess that's just another little thing that shows the hold of the ring on Bilbo, that his desire for the ring would so easily override his desire to leave Frodo with a secure future. That's it for this installment of Hobbit Hot Takes. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time in the not-so-distant but also undefinable future. That is to say, I don't know exactly when the next episode will be out, but I hope it will be a shorter break than last time. If you have any feedback, questions, comments about this episode or this project in general, or you want to share your Lord of the Rings experiences, please comment below. And if you have any feedback about technical aspects or accessibility, I would be very grateful for those as well, because I want to make this as accessible as possible for anyone who wants to peruse this content. So if you would like transcripts, I can publish them somewhere, or if anyone would like just the audio uploaded somewhere on its own, I can look into that. You just have to let me know what you need. With that said, this has been Hobbit Hot Takes. See you next time.